Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another Eye on Africa. I'm very happy today to have here Dr. Konadu. Dr. Konadu is John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Endowed Chair and Professor at Colgate University, where he teaches courses in African history and on worldwide African histories and cultures. With extensive archival and field research in West Africa, Europe, Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America, his writings focus on African and African diasporic histories, as well as major themes in world history. He is the author of Our Own Way in This Part of the World, Biography of an African Community, Culture, and Nation from Duke University, and also the Ghana Reader, History, Culture, Politics from Duke University also, Transatlantic Africa, 1440-1888 from Oxford University Press, the Akan Diaspora in the Americas also from the Oxford University Press, among many other books. A father and husband first and foremost, Konadu is also a healer who studied with his grandfather in Jamaica and then in Techiman, Central Ghana, as well as a publisher of scholarly books about African world histories and cultures through Diasporic African Press, Inc. So thank you for being here. We're delighted to have you here. And a warm welcome to Dr. Konadu, everybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay. So, first and foremost, I want to thank Nicole, Jamie, and the staff members who were able to put this opportunity together for me. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'll try to keep this moving and certainly engaging. I wanted to start this story with the person of Kofi Donko, the way I start the book, which is I start the book with his funerary rites. But I want to start a different way. And I want to start with 1960, the year of African independence, where some 17 African countries and nations gained their independence from their respective colonial overlords. 1960 was dubbed, therefore, the Year of Africa. And this year, 2020, on the Gregorian calendar, is the 60th anniversary of the Year of Africa. And so in the spirit of reflecting, thinking about African independence, decolonization, some of the themes which I try to poke at here in this conversation with you, independence for many of us who study Africa, and certainly many in the room have, this 1960 was a watershed moment. What I want to offer is a different way to think about that moment through unlikely characters such as Kofi Donko, his community, and his colony turned nation. Today, I want to focus on one African people and to look at how the evolution of culture and community, colony to nation, offers some very important and new insights into this crucial period that some of us are commemorating. In an interview in 1980, art historian Ray Silverman, and many of you know Ray Silverman at University of Michigan, interviewed Kofi Donko through an interpreter. Kofi Donko said this: for those in search of past events and matters connected with our culture, I will also let them know clearly how we go about things in our own way in this part of the world. And what Kofi Donko was saying, as both as a healer, as a blacksmith, as a wood carver, as a family head, and as a drummer, was that there were, in fact, particular ways in which he, his community, his countrymen and women approached the world, viewed the world, interpreted the world, and made sense of the world, and made their place in the world. Not sure if Silverman realized what he had in front of him. I took this statement as a point of departure for how to think about Ghana, Africa, in the world. That in fact, we can actually gain some very integral perspectives from these unlikely characters, from these characters who meant so much to their communities, but have not meant as much in the historical record and among historians. Kofi Donko was a peasant farmer and one who rode the fortunes and misfortunes of the cocoa boom that was crucial to the Gold Coast economy. The Gold Coast, of course, being the former colonial structure that morphed into the Republic of Ghana in 1957. Kofi Donko was also a very prominent healer. He came into the vocation of healing very young, as a teenager, and spent the next 60 to 70 years primarily as a healer, even though he was a very skilled blacksmith, among other traits. The question for us is, what might we gain or lose by thinking through Kofi Donko and his community for understanding or grasping some of the major themes that have made the 20th century world possible and that have made that world much more intelligible? And that is, what do we gain from the themes of colonial empire, religious and missionary institutions? What do we gain regarding medicine, health, and culture in this crucial, long 20th century? I offer that we gain much more than we lose by looking through the lens of Kofi Donko and his community. In fact, what I argue in the book is that on one level, individuals do not represent their community or culture. However, those who occupy different roles in a community or culture or society provide us with a wide-angle panoramic view and therefore provide integral perspectives on an evolving culture and society. I also argue that world history and African history is better served by focusing not on exceptional individuals who leave us a dense documentary trail. To me, that's easy, and therefore, for example, there are over 10,000 books and articles on Abraham Lincoln. Whereas people like Kofi Donko, who meant so much to his community, and how can we measure that meaning? At his funeral, which was a state funeral given for an ordinary peasant farmer, there were thousands and thousands of people that came to this man's compound while he laid to rest in an 11 by 10 room. And so, from a local regional scale, Kofi Donko became global through his intellect, through his healing vocation, and therefore offers us not only a local history, but a global history packaged in one person. What's important first to begin with, though I assume many of you are familiar with the general outline of contemporary Ghana and the Gold Coast, is that there's some features of the land in which Kofi Donko lived, in the time they lived, that we may not fully grasp. I want to bring your attention to it. The first map on my right, your left, is a contemporary map of Ghana, showing the region in which Kofi Donko spent most of his life in Techiman. And certainly he was born in Nkuranza in the village of Akumso Dumasi. This border of Ghana today comes out of the Asante Empire. Notice that the Asante Empire is larger, right, than the outlines of the present-day Republic of Ghana. And though scholars tend to treat the Gold Coast, colonial Gold Coast, as one colony, in fact, there were 3 different colonies. They were viewed differently by the Imperial Britain, they were resourced differently, and they, in fact, had functioned as their own autonomous portions of this colonial structure that I call a tripartite colony. If we think about the evolution of the Gold Coast to Ghana from that perspective, then we'll be able to grasp much of the contemporary happenings in Ghana today. That is, for example, if any of you have been to Ghana recently, you will know that the northern part of Ghana is less resourced and less, to use the sort of World Bank language, underdeveloped than the southern portions of Ghana. The southern portion of Ghana is what? Not solely, but largely Christianized, and therefore the orthodoxies of Christianity have taken a greater hold there, as opposed to, or contrast to, northern Ghana. Much of that is baked into the very cartography of the Asante Empire. That is, the British sought to create, or better yet, the British didn't create a colony, it simply divided the Asante Empire into these 3 colonies. And present-day Ghana reflects this particular cartographical history. Why does this matter for us? It matters because Kofi Donko was born into 2 hegemonies. On the one hand, because he lived in Techiman, Techiman was subjected to colonial Asante, or the Asante Empire, before it capitulated 1900, 1901. Then, in 1901, the British became the other empire. So Kofi Donko was born into a world that was framed or buttressed by 2 imperial powers. On the one hand, there was a local empire, the Asante, that cascaded this wider net over the lives of he and other members. But then there was another layer, the British Empire. And being born in this dual hegemony sets up much of the histories on the ground that we have completely either forgotten or omitted in our account of the movement or evolution of colonies to nations on the African continent. In fact, I would argue in the colonialized world. In this process from colony to nation, we have these 2 figures that are crucial to the common stories that are told. The common story is that, on my right, your left, Yasantua, right, from Ejisu, was the last force against British imperial rule. We're told that in the Yasantua War, named after her, that she mounted the last resistive effort against Imperial Britain. But what Kofi Donko and his community provide is this optic. You see, Yasantua is less the poster child for resistance than we ever tend to assume. In fact, in 1901, in letters she dictated to a Basel Mission Catechist, she said that she was never part of a movement to unseat the British in the Gold Coast. That she was never part of the rebellion. In fact, she's always been a loyal servant to the British Empire. In another letter, and both letters are, by the way, they're in the Rhodes House Library at Oxford University. She also makes it clear that she, among other stately women of high status in Techiman, too, were never part of this effort, were never part of the factions who tried to resist British colonial rule in the Asante heartland. And so what we get from this moment, right, is that Yasantua is less the image we have conjured up about her. In fact, she was very much immortal. She was very much less this rebel against empire that we're made out to be. And we get that through thinking through this moment when people like Kofi Donko, in fact, in Techiman, had in fact used British colonial overlordship as a way to get from under Asante overlordship. In other words, different interests are playing against each other to unseat the other, to remove a bit of hegemony for one party. And it's in this same context we can understand Kwame Nkrumah, which we'll come back to, we'll circle back to him. But for now, Nkrumah, when he comes to power, he realized that the same Asante that Asante War represented, the same Asante were the most conservative elements who wanted to keep British control intact. Because the Asante were able to maintain a level of power and authority, though they were colonized. In fact, Asante was viewed by the British when we read the district commission's report, they were viewed with a mixture of awe and fear. They were still an empire, right? And so this complicated mixture meant that Nkrumah could not launch his vision of Republic of Ghana under one unitary government without getting Asante on board. Asante, of course, pushed back. And in return, Nkrumah went to the Bronghofer region, which he essentially created in the new configuration of Ghana. And in doing so, he went to Techiman. Why Techiman? He went to Techiman because that's where there was a grassroots movement called the Bono Chimpim movement. And this was a movement to unite the Bono-speaking peoples, a subgroup, to mount an offensive against Asante hegemony. And so essentially, Nkrumah was able to use an alliance with Techiman and major figures like Kofi Donko, who were part of the infrastructure of that community, to essentially go around Asante and get enough buy-in to create the Republic of Ghana, right? But Nkrumah, as I'll talk about later, his iconic stature is really a trap, because it invites us on one hand to an anti-colonial statesman who was a Pan-Africanist, who was also one looking to form a United States of Africa, right? But on the ground, he was a different figure. On the ground, he was a figure that I would argue, and I'll try to demonstrate in a little while later, missed an important opportunity among other African statesmen in this crucial period of decolonization and independence. But we'll return to Nkrumah. When we think about this particular context for Kofi Donko, this is the configuration of the tripartite colony, minus the British Togoland. British Togoland came later in the story. But in this configuration, what we have here are the Northern Territories, the Crown Colony, as it were, of Asante, and of course, the Gold Coast Colony proper. This is the tripartite colony. Again, resourced, viewed, and of course, developed quite differently. So the Gold Coast Colony was viewed as the bastion of Christian and British values, views, Christian orthodoxy, commerce, whereas Asante was viewed to be the sort of noble savage, right? This was the empire that, but still, they rejected the Christianity, and particularly the Basel missionaries and other missionary groups. They were still attentive to all the rituals and cultural forms that made them an empire. And lastly, these folks in the northern part of Ghana, which is the north of the forest, and the forest in Ghana sort of, the demarcation line is 8-degree latitude north. That's where the forest sort of ended. And then from there it gets into what? Wooded savanna, and then of course just simply plain flat like grasslands, all the way out into the northern parts by Paga, Navarongo, and those regions, Bogatanga, and into the east, Yendi, and the like. The Northern Territory were viewed to be totally savages, not my word, I'm talking in third person, by the British, were viewed as completely savage. They were not any bit interested in Christianity. A number of the societies there had been attentive to Islam. They were not interested in being part of the commercial circuit operating. There was no land to farm cocoa, for example, the biggest cash crop in the colony. They had no gold. And so the Northern Territories were viewed, ironically, both by the Akan-speaking areas and by the British as being completely backwards, as being savages, right? And so what we have here are really 3 different colonies, right, that are administered, resourced, and viewed quite differently. These are all shaped and all refracted through, the life of Kofi Donko, because Kofi Donko, especially in his healing career, and Kofi Donko for us, he's born in Dumasi in Nkuranza. He moves to Techiman where he spends his life. His father is from Nkuranza, Yabadu. His mother, Akosu Atoa, is from Techiman, and that's where he spends most of his life. Techiman was a major crossroads town. In fact, it was the major nexus between southern Ghana and northern Ghana, or southern Gold Coast, northern Gold Coast, or in the language of the tripartite colony, it was the nexus between the Northern Territories and the Gold Coast colony. It is where the savanna ecologies and the forest ecologies meet. And in this crossroads town, it was one of the major markets. And so many of the northern goods, whether it be leather work, whether it be animals, whether it be some of the more immediate crops in the north, whether from rice to other kinds of grains, sorghum, millet, they were brought down into Techiman first and then dispersed throughout the other parts of the colony and later the nation itself. So Kofi Donkor, his lived experiences unfold in this major crossroads town between two ecologies, between two empires, between two sets of religious groups, Islam in the north, Christianity in the south, right? So he's in this intermediary area where he's able to not only apprehend and see what is happening north and south, but he's also able to, in many ways, take some from each of these worlds that he's a part of. And so, in my view, he is in fact the perfect specimen to look at these intra-African histories that are unfolding. That is, histories that are not hedged to the coast, that do not require a European interlocutor or European mediator to make sense of it. These are histories in the interior, among interior peoples, that have everything to do with these intra-African societies and their commercial, cultural, and other exchanges. This is a bird's eye view of Kofi Donkor's Techiman. This is Techiman Township, right? This particular map occurred in 1970, and so it gives you a spatial sense of the structuration of the town. More importantly, it really situates the crossroads intermediate position, the positionality of Kofi Donko in his community, I think in very sharp relief. Kofi Donko lived in the Tuntunase ward. This is the ward for blacksmith. His uncle and grandfather were blacksmith, which in the country language we call Ntumfu, which are quite different than the goldsmith or the other smith in the area. The blacksmith, as many of us know, they were the ones who fashioned, or the war metals, who fashioned the tools, implements, and weapons, everything from farming to warfare to utensils, they fashioned. And so the blacksmith were a crucial component not only to the community, but also to the healers. Because, for example, this particular metal bracelet I'm wearing is made by a blacksmith, but it's produced from an old gun, right? And so there are particular kinds of tools that the blacksmith would make for the market of healers. And Techiman was not unique in that they had a bevy of healers. In fact, most communities in Ghana, the Gold Coast, tripartite colony, would have a bevy of healers and therefore a market for a range of tools. So coming from a blacksmithing background, he was able to morph into the healing vocation much more smoothly than others, because in fact he provided literally the implements, the material culture for the craft of healing. He also comes, that is Kofi Donko, from a healing family. In this particular ward, he, in fact, his sisters, his mother, his grandmother were all healers, right? So he's literally fashioned, and so Kofi Donko provides this counterpoint, this counter view, whereby on the Gold Coast, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Christian orthodoxy is growing. And so young men, they're opting for the churches. They're opting for the missionary schooling that the missionaries provide. They're opting for the cash crop economy. Now, Kofi Donko, as a member of this tripartite colony, was not immune to these pullings. He simply weren't seduced by them. And I argue that it's precisely because of his location, right? His positionality in this crossroads town. Because in this town, as you can see here, see the Hausa ward, right? The Gomba ward. So many of the people from northern Ghana, they would have their own sections. In part informed by Islam, where the idea that in Islam, at least theologically speaking, Muslims should not be under the governance or rules of non-Muslims. And so these wards from the Hausa ward in Zungo, right? These distinct quarters are created. And what the Akan people do, they actually will attach the suffix for leadership to the name of the indigenous group. So for example, there will be a Hausa Hene. Hene referring to the local or district or group leader for that particular group. There'll be a Dagomba Hene. And that leadership position would sit on the local so-called traditional council representing these various communities. And so there was a bit of egalitarianism that was built in these particular wards. And so Kofi Donko lived amongst these variants, meaning he lived amongst people of northern Ghana, lived amongst people from southern Ghana, that is in the road to Kumasi. So people from the Asante region would also move into this region as well. So in other words, Techiman was like no other particular town because it was fed and nourished by these distinct groups, distinct religions, and from these distinct ecologies happening all in one place. Accra could not have this, right? That is the current capital and colonial capital. The Cape Coast, Elmina could not have this, right? And it is this particular blend of these factors and forces that shape, the skill, the acumen, and the life of Kofi Donko. Kofi Donko, he joins a cohort of healers in the 1920s. He was very young. He spent 7 years in training, and not because he was not capable. Because of his youth, the training takes longer, because part of the training becoming a healer is maturity. And so because he was brought into the healing vocation at a very young age, in fact, a childhood friend recalled when I interviewed her that her name was Anchiwa, and she said that Kofi Donko cried when he had to leave Kumsu Dumasi in Kuranza and go to Techiman to become a healer, because his uncle could not do the work anymore. He was too old. And so Kofi Donko, out of pity for his uncle, said, I'll try this. And there were 3 other candidates who tried to take on the vocation but failed. They could not grasp the language of the spiritual forces that were so crucial to the temporal work of healers. And so Kofi Donko said, out of pity for his uncle, said he'll try this. But he did cry, according to Anchia, on the way from Kotuma Techiman, because of his youth. And so he spent a longer time, but in that time he was able to, in fact, join a caste like this. This is a group of healers. The ones in training, they have shiri, or white clay that is retrieved from a river, usually a local stream, that has spiritual significance. And so these are the ones who are in training, where the teachers are lined up in the back. And this is sort of an early photo there. This is actually his sister, Ajiwa Kumsa, Kofi Donko's elder sister, who was trained earlier than he. But it'll give you a sense of the sort of cohort that he would have been a part of. And in the book, I go into some of his collaborators and his cohort people that trained with him. And so Kofi Donko, this is his socialization nexus. Again, unlike what's happening on the coast, right? This is the world in which he is, in fact, brought into. But it's not a new world, because, again, he comes from a family of healers and blacksmith. And in this world, you have a number of crucial, celebrations in which there are community events that everyone attends, and one of them is the Apo Festival. It happens in the Gregorian months of April and May, late March, April, and May. And Apo comes from the root word po, means to reject or to release, meaning in this particular ceremony moment, which lasts for sometimes up to a week or more, social standing flattens, meaning everyone who are leaders to the market person, to the commoners, they're all socially equal. And so people, commoners, throw insults at those in power in terms of critiquing how they rule, meaning the law relaxes, social standing and status flattens only for this period, right? And it happened based on the idea that if you keep what you feel inside, it not only hurts you, it hurts the community. So let's get it out. Let's confront it. And that's what this period does. It's really cathartic, right? It's a grand healing, if you can imagine, for the community. And it predates, and I think it may be more effective than the truth commissions that have been launched, let's say in South Africa and other places, or Rwanda, right? Because they really get out and get at the idea that human relationships are the most important relationships in any human community. And the way to get at that is to let people know how you really feel, what you really think, in a way that is not punitive. And in this period, the law relaxes. Central figures here are the healers you see here. I have for you a treat. Robert Rattray. Many of you know Robert Rattray and his body work in Asante. visited Techiman in the early 1920s when Kofi Donko was a youngster. They never met, at least not least what I can gather. At least what I saw from Rattray's papers in London. But he was able to capture a ceremony like this in Asante that I want to share with you. And this particular video is a silent video, which means that there's no talking, but I want you just to see some of what Rattray would have saw in Kofi Donko's world in 1920s, 23 I think exactly. And then this was the newest technologies, right? Captures ornate reel. Now, the Basel missionaries have a wonderful collection of photos, but those are still images. This is motion picture. And you really get to see some of the textures of life as lived in the 1920s in Asante proper. And mind you, Techiman was underneath Asante administratively, right? So essentially, this is an extension of Techiman, if you will. So you see the large umbrellas, you see the dress, the cloth, you see in a moment the drums, you see the children. There you go. They're holding a bodria, which is the horsetail whisk. They're dignitaries, they're common folks, you see it, the British, trench coat. Why in a tropical environment, I don't know, but he has it on. This is the large Atumpan drum. There you go. And I'm told that Rattray was a big fan. He was standing next to the Fonton drum. He loved the music. And he would record the music, by the way, on the phonograph that he would carry with him. Okay, I'm going to move on from there. And so what's key here is that Rattray would be not only the first, but he'd be among several anthropologists who would come to Techiman to seek out what Rattray had claimed was the origin. In fact, Rattray claimed in one of his trilogies, and there are 3 major books on Asante it's still it's a treasure of information. And so in Asante, literally the book published in 1921, Rattray claimed that if you want to know a Akan culture, its cultural forms and nuances, you have to go to the source, which is in Techiman, right? That is, the source of Akan culture was not in Asante proper, in Kumasi, it was in Techiman. And that's why Rattray would travel there. And along the way, anthropologists like Rattray, like Evian Meriowitz, her husband, Herbert, had worked as an art instructor in Achimota College on the coast. Achimota College, of course, is what essentially blossoms into the University College, and then, of course, the University of Legon. And here is one of the perhaps most significant anthropologists, Michael Dennis Warren. Dennis Warren, of course, he comes to Techiman as a Peace Corps student in 68-69. And he then goes to Indiana University to do his PhD dissertation. And what does he focus on? Techiman, because as a Peace Corps worker, he worked for 2 years teaching science. He had a science background as an undergraduate, teaching science in Techiman Secondary School. And in that period, he got to know some of the local people, including one of the most important informants, Kofi Donko. And so here, Dennis Warren, and this picture right here, folks, speaks really 1,000 words, because this picture is sort of the classic feedback loop for knowledge production in Africa. That not all, but some of it still pervades today, which is this, that African languages, even for someone who actually had a penchant for language, but he never was able to actually have a conversation or have an interview in the Akan Tree language, or Bonuchi. He knew some of the language, but he was never able to actually have his own. And so what you have here is this feedback loop of a mediated knowledge, whereby Awusu Brempong, who later went on to teach at Legon in the Institute of African Studies, he becomes the primary interpreter and research assistance for Dennis Warren, right? And so the feedback loop was that knowledge was produced It was interpreted and translated. It was then packaged under single authorship. And then, of course, he received tenure, promotion, and distinction. He receives very little, not a recommendation to go to Iowa University. Kofi Donko received some zinc roof. And why does this matter? Because Kofi Donko, according to Warren, was the most important informant for a dissertation, which, by the way, is over 500 pages. It's dense. And that dissertation of Warren becomes the bedrock for his scholarly career. In fact, Warren's place in medical anthropology 20th century is buttressed. In fact, I would argue it's the intellectual map of Kofi Donko. But it's not my word or my interpretation, it's Warren's word. Warren says the most important healer was a venerated priest healer called Kofi Donko. In Warren's publications, his 13-level taxomatic scheme for Bono understandings of medicine, healing, and therapy, he said comes from one Kofi Donko. But in my paper trail hunting, I started from a ground zero for Kofi Donko. There was nothing written about him. And my job, was to vacuum as much as I could. So I went to Indiana, went for the notes, went for the audio recordings, and guess what? The audio recordings in Kofi Donko were erased. Warren claims that it was to create space for more interviews. Of course, I'm suspicious, as a historian I'm supposed to be. I said, really? For someone who is your primary informant, you would erase the tapes? For someone that was so crucial to your research, that rescued, right, his project? In fact, I want to read to you a particular encounter that comes from Owusu Brempong, who I interviewed and who I saw this past summer in Ghana. Owusu Brempong says this. He says, quote, "When Mike Warren declared his intention to work on traditional medicine with me, there was a need to study with a specialist, and I could not think of anyone but Nana Kofi Donkor, my own grandfather. One morning, Mike and I decided to visit Nana Kofi Donkor to ask him to give us his help for the proposed enterprise. Sadly, upon arrival, Nana Kofi Donkor was not prepared to work with us. He, Kofi Donkor, stated categorically that he was not prepared to work with any white man because the white men are cheats. Indeed, it was a very embarrassing situation, which I tried to elude Mike from it. I did not want him to know the conversation between my grandfather and me. I told Mike that he was busy and that we could come back later. That evening, I went to my father, D.K. Owusu. D.K. Owusu was the major interpreter and informant for Eva Meriewicz, right? In all her books she produced, she was an absentee researcher. She spent her time in London, and she would employ D.K. Owusu and also the celebrated nationalist artist Kofi Donko, right? Who was crucial to the iconography of independence. He was also an interpreter. And so it's only ironic that Meriewicz's informant son becomes the interpreter and translator for Michael Warren. And told him about what happened at my grandfather's house. Upon hearing the news, my father laughed and said to me, quote, "I'm not surprised that was the character of your grandfather who he inherited." He continued, quote, "You see, when the white man first came to Techiman, it was your grandfather, meaning Kofi Donko, and his colleagues who stopped them from staying here. My father, Aja Kwajo Owusu, and his friends, the other priests, went to the bush, collected plenty of wasp in a gourd. At night, when the white man was asleep, my father and the other Busumfor or healers went to the white man's abode to release the wasp into his room to sting him. Aja Owusu and other priests felt that the white man was tricky and going to destroy our culture and traditions. Therefore, they did not want him in Techiman. The white man then moved from Techiman to Wenchi." End quote. My father laughed desperately after his narration. And so this is the encounter between this sort of backstory to knowledge production, right? This sort of integral lens to this feedback loop of how knowledge is produced and brought to the marketplace, but really what happens in really this process. Now, at this point, Awusu Brempong is, quote, apprehensive after hearing his father's story. He asked his father for advice, and D.K. Awusu in turn told him to accompany him the next morning to Kofi Donko's house. Awusu continued, "The next morning around 8:30 a.m., I was at my grandfather's house with my father. After initial customary greetings, D.K. Awusu went straight to the matter of concern. During his appeal, he alluded to his work with Evia Meriwetz, which helped in the formation of the Bronghofer region and Techiman's freedom from the Asante. And in fact, as the book narrates, but I won't get into it here, I'll save it for you all when you read the book, Evia Meriwetz was being used by then Techiman Akomfi Amiao to ask her to petition the British government to essentially affirm an agreement that Techiman had made with the British Empire to what? To be free from Asante overlordship. Asante, of course, rejected that agreement and maintained their overlordship. And so Evia Meriwetz was used as a conduit to make that case to the British High Courts and the British officials in the Parliament. Evia Meriwetz in turn had what? Access to Techiman informants through D.K. Awusu. So again, this is that sort of important integral backstory to knowledge production that we often don't get in these histories. Awusu continues, after Papa's appeal, Nana Kofi Donko turned to me and asked, "Do you say he's a good white man who will not cheat me?" I replied, "Nana, he's a good man. He taught me at Techiman Secondary School, therefore I've known him for a long time." End quote. That morning, Awusu tells us, after the meeting, Nana Kofi Donko agreed to meet Mike and I the following Friday, and Papa and I thanked him by shaking his hand. The following Friday, we readied ourselves with 2 bottles of schnapps, and at 9 a.m., Mike and I were at Nana Kofi Donko's house. This time, he received us with open arms. It was indeed a red-letter day for me, and I felt very proud of the success of the first meeting. That day, Nana Kofi Donko was very generous. He slaughtered 2 tortoises for us, and stew and kenke, fermented cornmeal dough, accompanied the schnapps for the day. This was our first meeting. And so what happens thereafter is this notable career is literally built on the intellectual history and map of Kofi Donko. But Kofi Donko is simply regarded in Warren's work as an informant. Awusu Brempong is simply regarded as an assistant. Brempong claims that he did 85% of the work, translations, drawing of local maps, surveys, interpreted, and he had to give all his data to Warren. I went to Warren's collection, both at Iowa University where he worked and Iowa State. And I went through all Warren's work. I could not find these books and maps. Okay? What I did find, however, is that in all my search over a decade, having gone through all these archives fashioned by empire, I'm in Oxford, I'm at SOAS, I'm at British Library, definitely in Ghana, I'm at the National Archive in Accra, I'm in the Manshia in Kumasi, I'm at the Regional Archive in Sunyani. I'm just gobbling up as much as I could. Essentially what I'm trying to get is any information from anyone who spent time in that community. So I went to the Red Cross National Archives. I'm in the Missionary Archive. An important mission in Techiman was the Holy Family Hospital and the Roman Catholic missionary that brought the hospital there in the 1950s. So I rummaged through their archives. I get to find out that looking through all these archives over 10 years and gobbling everything I could, in addition to Harvard, Indiana, a number of archives here in the state, Northwestern, for example, the most important archive was not the ones fashioned by empire, but the ones that were in the memories of the people who knew him. So I found one of the wives of Kofi Donkor, plural wives, right? Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You might think at first, well, this is a function of patriarchal life, but actually, this was a matter of cultural circumstance. For example, when his uncle died, according to a cultural form and practice, he inherits, as the nephew, as the Wofase, inherits not only his uncle's vocation, but also he inherits the responsibility for caring for his uncle's wife. And so he, in effect, was married, right? And there are other circumstantial wives that he inherited. For example, one woman came to his Busumthi, or his healing center, for work, and she had divorced 4 or 5 times. And so while in trance, he was convinced that when he came to from trance that he was to marry her, right? Because she didn't have a husband, she wanted a husband, right? So there's a number of circumstantial, but these were usually fleeting. They were short-lived. His major collaborator and actually partner throughout the long haul was Afia Munufie, right? Munufie means that she's born on a fresh Friday, a new Friday, which is a special day in the Khan calendar of 42 days. And so she, was the primary person, in his life, in his healing work. And more importantly, she could hold her own. She had been an independent trader in the markets. She had learned to heal through her uncle, who was also a Dunsini or herbalist. She dealt with not only so-called women healing matters, but also she was, again, the major sustainer and supporter for his varied work as blacksmith, as healer, as woodcarver, as drummer, and as husband, and as healer. And so, two of them together began to forge a life in medicine, in marriage, and in family. All the while, the politics of the Gold Coast is moving towards this particular period of independence, which we'll come to in a moment. In the meantime, Kofi Donko was also a teacher. But his teaching was not simply local, but also global. How so? Here, this is Nana Kwaku Sechi. He is from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. He now lives in Miami. He was one of the first diasporic Africans to be trained by Kofi Donko. That's last. And so, how did he get to him? Kofi Donko, he was in the back. This is one of Kofi Donko's son, Kofi Ifa. Skilled healer as well. This is Kofi Abor. All of them have passed away. He was the Ochiami, or the speech intermediary, because in Khan cultures, you don't speak directly between peoples of authority. You speak through an intermediary. Much like here, if you want to speak to the CEO of a company you're angry with, you go to customer service, right? You don't go to the CEO. And so, Nana Sechi sees a film called Bona Medicines in which Kofi Donko was the featured person and Kofi Ifa, his son. Bona Medicine was later released in 1987 as Healers of Ghana and produced by a company in New Jersey, right? And so Sechi, he sees the film or he hears about it, and then he writes a letter to Kofi Ifa, who puts him in contact with his father. And so Nana Sechi trained with Kofi Donko because by then Kofi Donko's ideas have become global. I have a quick story I'll share with you. Kofi Donko's idea got so global that in the 1980s, 1989 to be precise, of course, doing this Cold War politics, right? In East Germany, there were Ghanaians, right? And Kofi Donko's name circulated, so much so that an East German man of European ancestry wrote to Kofi Donko and asked Kofi Donko to kill his wife because this man was afraid his wife would take his money that he had in his bank account, take his house and everything else. Kofi Donko never replied, and I suspect why. Because Kofi Donko as a healer is disavowed. He's into saving human life, not terminating. But he was prohibited by the rules of his spiritual force called Asabonte Kwabena from engaging in any such acts. But the point is that Kofi Donko's ideas had reached these various parts. The Caribbean basin had reached North America, it had reached Europe, so much so that people were now requesting. In fact, this man was so desperate, he wrote a second letter saying, look, Nana, speaking to Kofi Donko, I'll give you a new car if you help get rid of her. Kofi Donko never acted, never responded to the letter. But the letter was found among Kofi Donko's, what I call his papers, which was scattered, things, miscellaneous hanging around. And this healing training was from the Asante region, right? In fact, there were people that came from northern Ghana, came as far as what is now Burkina Faso, early on the Upper Volta, came from Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and Bonduku, came from Togo, right? Sisi no Kofi Donko. So he was not only a trans-regional figure, but a global figure, right? And what's equally remarkable is that Kofi Donko, though he was very attentive and very comfortable in his own cultural platform and his spirituality, many or most of his clients were either Muslim or Christian. In fact, I found 2 record books where a secretary, a scribe, took notes of people who came to the Kofi Donko Herbal Clinic, as it was called, in the 1980s. And I was able to reverse engineer it to see, you know, trying to project backwards what his earlier career would have been like over 60 years, which means he would have essentially healed or offered therapy to over 100,000 people over his healing career. And in one of the books, the 662 people who identified their religious orientation, 33% of them were Protestant Christian. A few were Catholic. A number of them were Muslims. People were also of indigenous spirituality. And in Larry's case, one people identified their affiliation as Hallelujah. and so his therapy and healing was not only trans-regional and transnational, it was also trans-religion. That he was concerned with 2 things: deploying health with care, regardless of people's religious, social, political standing. Even though he could have been politically powerful, he stayed away from people in periods of power. And that was, as Wilson Brent Poem recalled, was his trump card. He knew people in power, and they also came to him because of his ritual and other services, but he never ascended to a particular stool position, as it were, in the language of the account people. And many of these people would come out to his funeral rites, even though he was a so-called fetish priest, which is a terrible word that still carries, unfortunately, weight in discourse of African spirituality and culture. Kofi Donko's, healing prowess and his reputation also spread to the new projects in Africa. 1960s and 70s, especially, you have a number of projects that are sponsored between these national departments of health, Ghana being one, with the United Nations, as well as the World Health Organization, or WHO. They were trying to integrate, or at least create a bridge between allopathic biomedicine and indigenous medicines, therapeutics. And so one of the projects here, which is the primary care training for indigenous healers, or PREPE as it was called, this was revolutionary in the second half 20th century Africa. This hasn't been tried before. And the occasion was that these training sessions were for the healers, to give them a certain functional skill in sort of rudimentary biomedicine, right? And so Kofi Donko was instrumental in that. In fact, the film Bone of Medicine, later called Healers of Ghana, was created to showcase this integration between these 2, therapeutic worlds. Kofi Donko poured the opium libation in his compound to that particular world. But what Kofi Donko and others realized is that this was a one-way process of knowledge, meaning biomedical workers did not want to learn from healers, they simply wanted to train the healers in biomedicine. This was a one-way transfer of knowledge. And so Kofi Donko and others realized this and created their own. And so they created an organization, 2 organizations. One was called, they renamed this organization and they called it Abibi Duro Ne Bofo Duro Nkabumu, which is African medicine, European foreign medicine in unity, right? And in doing so, they essentially reclaim, their role in this, that we're equal partners. But Kofi Donko in this case was exceptional, though he was an ordinary person. By that I mean this. Doctors, there were 2 Dutch doctors at the Holy Family Hospital, the main hospital in Techiman. And those doctors, they would refer their patients, to Kofi Donko. This was unheard of. I'll say it again, because we haven't felt the sort of resonance. Medical doctors trained in biomedicine would send their patients to Kofi Donko. In fact, one of these Dutch doctors argued this. He said, look, statistically, indigenous healers, actually have an advantage to us. He says, look, for a matter like snakebite, our medications are less effective and efficient as the indigenous medicines are. And so what doctors began to realize, and this was, again, this is sort of, epiphany, a moment of epiphany, that the sort of, inherent superiority that was believed to be rooted in biomedicine wasn't so on the ground, right? That, in other words, that there was a recognition by these Dutch doctors that there were some portions of biomedicine, trauma, emergency, that they were great at. But long-term health and care, healing, that was, the healers had that particular area or portion, an advantage there, right? And again, Kofi Donko was the linchpin for this sort of common ground understanding, right? And so Kofi Donko continued to heal in his later years. One North American visitor in 1981 said, when you came to his compound, you see his compound there, it was just pure pandemonium. People were in line with the tickets, because by then he had a scribe that would take information about which region, your name, religious affiliation, the particular ailment, the treatment that was prescribed. And I was fortunate to find these two record books because the young men in this compound were using it to write down cell phone numbers. They were tearing out pages arbitrarily. And I had to grab it from one of them. And I would transcribe it in an Excel file and give it back to the family because it's their property. But they didn't see the value in this record book. And so from that record book, we were able to put into sharp relief, into perspective, in this case, he's healing this young child with foot. And of course, over here, he's using a telescope that was given to him by an African-American visitor, right? So even though Kofi Donko could use a technique or a instrument that was not from his cultural world, he was deeply rooted in that world, meaning he didn't compromise in one bit. But he also appreciated what this instrument could do for his patients, right? And so in other words, he was flexible. Why? At a crossroads town between two empires, between two ecologies, you learn to take the best from the worlds you have without compromising your own particular platform. And this is, in wrapping up, this is what I will argue is where there's a great missed opportunity for the nationalist period. And I want to frame this the importance of Kofi Donko and his community and the evolution of that community in this way. I want to frame it in the year 1948. And I'm going to pull quickly from the epilogue here, whereby Kofi Donko was this versatile individual, farmer, drummer, blacksmith, woodcarver, healer, husband, family head. But he was also the custodian and interpreter of shared values. He was certainly a facilitator of cultural renewal. He promoted social cohesion. He settled disputes. And he was an assessor and planner in the growth of this community. And from that perspective, he, rather than, and I'll come back to this, other than the so-called architects of Ghanaian independence, were better positioned to decolonize the Gold Coast than the figure of Kwasi Nkrumah and his cast members. To the point, I argue this, that although political independence was won, the fervor that produced it also exposed an ailment that Kwasi Nkrumah could call neocolonialism, but Nkrumah himself could not corral the centuries of groups that had pursued their own self-interest, nor heal the colonized psyche of independent Ghana. In fact, in the 1948 Watson report, where there was rebellion in Accra, set off by the killing of these, ex-servicemen, right, who approached the colonial government for their pensions, and a few were shot, and that led to riots. In the riots, what I found most remarkable is that the people rioting were going after the European goods in the European stores. And for me, it showed that the desire for British supply goods, notions of beauty and civilization were not lost on the rioters, owned by foreign merchants because they wanted the goods and what they symbolized. And this is what the Watson reports concluded, which I think was prophetic. It said, quote, "Save among the older population, there is an unconfessed desire for Europeanization, at least in many aspects. We say unconfessed because, while undoubtedly growing, it is not yet strong enough to cast off the shackles of tribalism. But the hands of the clock cannot be turned back. The movement is gathering momentum, even if cloaked at times by anti-racial expression. We doubt if it is sufficiently realized what problems these changes entail. Native authority, in its widest sense, is diminishing. Old religions are becoming undermined by modern conceptions. Earlier disciplines are weakening. Others must be devised to take their place." And what I interpret this particular crucial passage because by old religions and early disciplines, what the Commission of the British Empire targeted was the real obstruction to effective foreign rule. That is, self-sustaining ideas and practices integral to the evolution of indigenous cultures, social orders, and community life. In a word, what they were after was in fact what Kofi Donko had essentially personified. That is, Kofi Donko had built a community among kinfolks and strangers that was not built like Ghana was. Ghana was built on the archetypes of European nations and the United States. In fact, the Ghanaian Constitution, the most recent iteration, was based on the U.S. Constitution, 1992. And what I argue here is that if you're going to build a decolonized society, why use as your model or template sexist, racist, and politically structured societies as your model, as your template? And so people like Kwame Nkrumah, rather than being these statements of independence, what I argue is that they were in fact a function of this forced intimacy, I call it. That colonialism was forced intimacy. It was an inquisition. And by forced intimacy, I also add this concept of propinquity, which is the idea of closest proximity, meaning that there's a tendency for people to form bonds, whether friendship, romantic, or subjugated, with those whom they encounter often. And it is this particular proximity, this forced intimacy, where ecologies, where homes, where sacred spaces were now open, without control of that openness and access, and were then feasted upon by the three most important institutions in most people's lives. That is religious, in this case the church, healthcare, missionary hospitals and clinics, and schooling, missionary schools. These three institutions that were the axes for human community were controlled by the same missionary ideologies. And rather than attack that to the target to decolonize, Nkrumah and his Big Six architects, they in fact reaffirmed it. And so what is therefore ironic and surprising is that anti-colonial statements like Nkrumah, and you can put a lot of people on this list, rather than tear down the architecture in decolonizing of colonial rule ideologically, structurally, and otherwise, they reified it. The cocoa board that was crucial to the cocoa industry that buoyed the colony remained in place. Diversification didn't happen because of that. At independence, 1957, Ghana's currency, the cedi, named after the cowrie shell, was at 1-to-1 with the pound sterling. It was equivalent. There was a squandering of that, for a reason we can discuss in the QA, but my point here is that elders and cultural archives were replaced by churches, hymn books, and schooling, missionary schooling that took a hold. At independence, 1957, the majority of Ghana's population was demographically this: rural, non-Christian, and farming. These were the lived experience and hallmark of Kofi Donkor. Therefore, Kofi Donkor, I argue, offered a decolonized, non-national approach to decolonization, meaning that we often think that the natural outcome or the inevitable outcome of decolonization is a nation. when a nation is only one political option that comes out decolonizing, right? But the nation was offered by Nkrumah. In fact, Nkrumah said what? Seek ye the political kingdom, which is a reference to a biblical verse, right? Showing how steeped Nkrumah was in the Christian orthodoxy that had his hands wrapped around the colony-turned nation. So I argue that Nkrumah and his Big Six were the least qualified to decolonize. And therefore, the consequences are still being felt throughout Africa today because of this missed opportunity. And I hope you check out the book.
Thank you so much for the
Thank you.
fascinating.
Did I stay within time?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So it's time for questions and comments.
Yes, sir. My question is, so the traditional healing sphere was booming in the 80s, as you say, people needing to hire scribes. As then the 90s and the 2000s come around, how is this scene coming to the present?
Well, there's a number of threads here. As I hint they are in the book. There were a number of movements, for example, Kwasi Konadu, who, from Ghana, he goes to Howard University, gets a PhD, I think in theology or something else. He comes back to Ghana and starts a movement called Africania, right? The idea of reclaiming traditional, in his mind, culture and spirituality against, again, the growing Christian orthodoxy on the coast, and certainly, it's reaching Kumasi, it's reached Techiman. But not with the same, sort of force and veracity because of sheer distance. And in this movement, he's pushing it back against all of these, icons because, as anyone who's been to Ghana will know that the chochos or minibuses, hair salons, shops, they all have some biblical phrasing, right? For example, God is everything barbershop, or he's the only one. Hair salon, or Jesus lives on the back of the chocha truck. So so the theology is saturated, at least in terms of externally. What does that mean for healers? It meant the same thing for intellectual production. You will notice that, as the book kind of provides, is that in the 80s and 90s, you find that structural adjustment programs take a hold. The coups, from Achimpong to Rawlings, right? The uncertainty in Ghana, really takes a hold. And in that uncertainty, it meant that institutions of higher learning and the archives are underfunded. I mean, greatly. Meaning, Legon used to be the flagship institution in the 60s and 70s for scholars. In fact, scholars of whatever, culture, racial background, if you didn't cut your teeth in Legon or Dakar or Ibadan, yes. If you didn't spend time in these places, you weren't a legitimate Africanist. And so some of you will attest to that. You were just not, right? These were the premier centers of learning. They all fall in funding, in resource, and in what they study, right? And so that had a corollary effect, in analogous terms for the healing vocation, because now the political economy of the country is shifting in these uncertain times, and therefore, the healers begin to essentially settle down. And so what happens in Techiman, which in some cases is unique, some cases across the colony, the country at this point, is that Kofi Donko's, services are through the roof. Because at that point, that's when the primary healthcare program comes into effect, because the Holy Family Hospital requires that now there are new kinds of diseases that are operating. So for example, by the mid-'80s, they get the first case of HIV/AIDS. This is vast, it's not malaria, the typical, culprits, right? It's not yellow fever, it's not typhoid, right? It's HIV/AIDS, right? Abortions. having gone through the records of the Holy Family Hospital, is on the rise. So there are new kinds of maladies and new kinds of social, right, issues that are coming up. And then, of course, in the 80s, you have what? The wildfires. And then Nigeria sends back to Ghana in revenge. Over 1 million Ghanaians are forced back. Added to the wildfires, added to economics. I mean, it's a pot filled with so much uncertainty and chaos. But the stabilizing forces was Techiman and Kofi Donko. So he would travel to the north. He would travel to the south. Even in the 90s with the civil war in the north, right? He would travel there, right? So he was this sort of stabilizing force, and people knew it. In fact, what I found remarkable is that I never met Kofi Donko. He died in 1995, August 8th to be exact. And is that people were still coming to see him when I was there in the 2000s, even as early as last year. People were still coming hoping to find him, So in many respects, Kofi Donko is an ordinary person, but he's also extraordinary. He's a common rural dweller, but he's also this particular, intellect as well as, practitioner, right? And that's what I said, this multiverse of a person with his wide-angle view is able to give us so much through this lived experience and ideas of his community.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this rich talk, and it's been provoking a lot of ideas for me. And I always tell my students that the most interesting places to study are those crossroads, or what looks like the edge could be the center. And I feel like you're relocating the center of Ghana to a new space, and that within that center there's a particular individual that arises, but you contextualize so that people might say, well, this is an exceptional individual, but you're putting this in a context that's global, and I find that so valuable. And as an East Africanist, I'm reminded a little bit of work by Steve Fireman, what he called the peasant intellectual, kind of lifting up local forms of knowledge and power. And some of those people ended up going to the UN to campaign for land rights and things, so there's a bit of a global thing. But I wondered how you situate yourself in relationship to someone like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who also really champions indigenous language and wrote about decolonizing the mind. Are you seeing yourself at all connecting to that, or are you thinking about something different?
Something different, but I would be lying, which I try not to do. If I said I in some ways, I'm a big fan of Ngugi. I met him once at a conference in Dobbs Ferry. It was a New York, I think, State Regional African Studies, conference. And so I think I'm very familiar with his work. And so yes, his project, I'm a big fan of African languages. And as you and I spoke individually, I'll kind of bring it to the full group here, is that I was born in Island, Jamaica, so I wasn't born in Ghana. And I had to learn Akan Chi language. And it is one of the most remarkable transformations of me as a person, as a scholar, because I learned Kiswahili like you as well. But there's something about the tree, the tones and the rhythm, there's something about it that I couldn't do this if I didn't know the language. I just couldn't. And I think much of my work, is rooted in indigenous languages. So I am intellectually, hopefully, I'm not the writer as Ngugi, certainly, but intellectually in terms of his project. And I think at one point he said, look, I'm going to write only in Kikuyu, right? And so I thought about that, having tree, but again, my challenge is that who's going to read this? Because in Ghana, the literacy in the indigenous language is not there. Spoken, yes, but literally, so, that's where, I can't follow through with Ngugi, but certainly if I'm with him as an intellectual cohort, right? I'm in company with him to say that decolonization is a very, complicated and even sometimes truncated process for a number of things, right? I'm simply offering that the nation wasn't the only option, right? And at least not structured that way, right? That there were other options. And to be brutally honest is that, we shouldn't expect either when we have these national statesmen that come out of the missionary schools, where the British had a very clear, message and effort to create bicultural subjects, right? Black Englishmen, as they call them, where these Africans will be appreciative of what things the British consider traditional, but be fully versed in the views and values of the British, And so Agre becomes what? An icon, right? Becomes an icon of this bicultural person. And you see that in Nkrumah, you see that in J.P. Donkor, and the so-called Big Six that are a part of that, right? And you look broadly from 57 to 60, and you see that as well. Humphrey Bonnet next door. You see that in Zikiwe, right? You see that certainly in Senghor. you see, I mean, you just see these tentacles. I think on that point of language, and in your region, Julius Nyerere comes the closest because he got it right on language. You have to make at least one of the languages, the language in which people have to filter their lives through, right? In other words, I wanted Kofi Donko, he was alive, to be able to see himself in here. If he didn't see himself in here, then I failed.
I just had a question about the connections between, you mentioned Kofi Donko was a healer, but also a blacksmith, a drummer, many other things. I don't remember all of them. But the connections between those things and why those connections might be important for his story. Great,
that's an excellent question, including the others that came before. So the healing work is a multi-pronged enterprise. I'm thinking of drawing an analogy with music, but I don't want to stretch the analogy too far. So there are some musicians who not only sing, but they play the instrument. But they not only play, they do production, right? That is queuing up, where the bass line goes, on what layer does the tracks go, right? And these are people who also will upload their music to, YouTube channel. In other words, they are skilled in all the strands that make up being a whole musician. And I think holistically, Kofi Donko, as a drummer, you have to be a drummer because the language in which you drum is a tonal language. And drumming is part of what? The festive and ritual, acts of being a healer. As you saw in the black and white, video, which by the way, I pulled from the Royal Anthropological Society in London. They had this beautiful, there's a number of other pieces they found in their archive. So you had to be a drummer, meaning you have to know the drum language, because it's really part of the healing process in terms of these rituals that are enacted as a function of being a healer. The same is true for blacksmithing. You need to know the tools of the trade. And so being a blacksmith allowed him to make his own tools, but also allowed him to make a living. Because as anyone knows who study people who will rule, you can't live off farming alone. Farming is seasonal. Crops are seasonal. So you have to have what we now call different streams of income, of livelihood, right? So you can think of it as entrepreneurial. Kofi Donko he and his wife had cocoa farms as well. And on those farms, he would employ migrant workers from Ghana, from what is now northern Ghana and Burkina Faso. There would come migrant workers to work on his farm seasonally, right? And so, as a healer, knowing the pharmacopoeia, knowing the landscape was crucial. So he was also an environmentalist and an ecologist, because you had to know where to find which medicine, which to find which bark, which root, which particular plant, right? And how to be able to combine them for a particular therapeutic outcome. And then being a woodcarver, right? Being a woodcarver allowed him also to be able to sustain himself, to be able to sell his work in the markets. And wood carving is crucial to healing, and it might not seem that way, but in the Busumfie, or the spiritual centers, or so-called shrine houses, there's shrine art. In fact, Dennis Warren published several articles in African Arts, a journal, with this shrine art, and they're made of wood carvings. Right? And these shrine arts may have a healer, with a raffia, skirt or dussel. They may have a sword or akufena, right? So all the skills that he had, farming, blacksmithing, healing in general, wood carving, they all fed his enterprise largely because he was mostly a healer. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. Really stimulating. The book is out already?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, I just wanted to build off that last question, I guess. If you could talk maybe more specifically about the specific healing practices, wondering if this, first of all, is a comb,
Mm-hmm.
or if this is some other shrine, or so-called shrine. And if so, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit more about maybe how music and dance is involved in the healing practices, and also maybe spirit possession.
Indeed. That's a great question as well. So, akom has been shrouded in mystery in terms of what is it. Linguistically, akom, the root word of akom is kom, K-O-M, and it refers to the idea of prophecy, but also the idea of hunger. So, for example, if I want to say that I'm hungry, which I'm a little bit hungry right now, I would say akom deme, the prefix ekomdeme. Hunger possesses me, hunger takes me. Akom, right? The affix changes, but it's the same root, same word, meaning hunger, right? And the idea is that for the healer to be able to commune with the spiritual force, he or she has to be hungry, to be satiated by that force. And so, just so happens that I also happen to be a healer as well. And so, the ring, the kawa that I'm wearing is not for decoration. And I can tell you what it feels like to give you, some perspective. That it's like watching a movie where you're in front of the TV screen or the big screen at the theaters, and you see yourself. You see, though my eyes are closed, and usually I feel a band of sort of energy, like a headband, around my head, and my eyes are closed. And I'm shaking a bit at first because now you have two sources of energies in the same human body. And so the nervous system has to be able to accommodate. It looks like a seizure, but it's not a seizure because it's not a physiological reaction as much as it is the body trying to accommodate two forces of energies when it's built for one. And I liken it to pregnant women. Now you have two beings occupying one body. It's a metaphor. I'm not trying to say literally. It's a metaphor. So when two beings are occupying a body, of course, it takes on a different, feeling. And so in that moment, what I see is whatever I see is like a movie, and I try to communicate that, right? In terms of so-called possession and trance. And the way I was trained, and I was trained by Kofi Donko's family, years after I finished my dissertation in field work, because I didn't want ever to conflate the two. And so, the experience is one of, it is so pure and spiritual. It reminds me of the accounts of Rattray when he described what he saw in 1921, 1923, which is that there can be drumming to induce this particular state, but the way that I am Busumfu, like Kofi Donkor, and if I may, I'm gonna try to, can I go back? Yeah. See what he's carrying? This pad is called a kashere. In it there are medicines, dried and pounded and whatever, and there are other ingredients, which I won't name, but there are other ingredients in there. And this pad, of course, is to carry this pan. And in this pan is the sort of physical, right? And I'm sure you've seen some, this is the physical shrine that is sort of like the cell phone, allows you to contact the spiritual force. So this force comes into the pan, then it comes in through the pad, the kashere, and into the head. And then it goes throughout the body and comes back up. And that's when you get the shaking. Then after that, it subsides, right? Because it runs through the nervous system. And part of the training is to learn how to accommodate this force. Much like a first-time mother is very difficult, because my wife, we have 3 daughters, so I've seen it. First-time mother it's uncomfortable. This second and third child, I'm not saying less comfortable. I want to be very clear. I'm not proposing as a man that is less uncomfortable. All I'm saying is that you have experience to be able to know what to do. That's all I'm saying. And so as a healer, you learn over those years to accommodate this force, right? To carry it, and to communicate, to know the language of it. And so he's right now walking in the streets of Techiman during the Apo Festival, the same Apo Festival that Rattray captured. And in doing so, he's in this state where, again, his eyes are closed, much like me. He's wearing these talismans, right, for his own protection. And I wear the same as well when I carry. but only on festive days. I don't carry, it's only once every 42 days on the calendar. And in doing so, what's beautiful is that there is no drumming, it's just words. And the person who offers the words is called the Ochiami, right? And there are parallels with the Eve and the Ga, right? And they speak this incantation, right? I won't speak one to you, but I'll give you a sort of a sense of it. There's an old drum text, and it's called Asutra Kwain, right? And it's at least a few hundred years old. And in an earlier book, I argue this text is the matrix for understanding of common societies, right? And the text goes something like this. Esu Tano. I'll start it this way. Asutra Kwain, Akwain Chasu, Openi Wine. Asutra Kwain, Akwain Chasu, Openi Wine. Yebo Kwanyiko Tusuno, Asufi Tete, Asufi Udmankuma Badie, Kronkung Tano, Brefia Tano, Asu Brekete, Ajakrantie, Asante Kotogani Busu, Asu Brempong, Asu Brempong, Takofri Brempong, and it sort of goes on from there. And if you hear the pong, 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 these are the tones, right? So my name can play on the drum, Kwasi, Don, Don, Don. And so this is what's happening. There's an incantation, and in that, they're calling the spirit. Say, Esu, Esu, Aja Krantie, Ubebasisiayamu. And what happens is, and then you see the body begin to sway side to side. And when the spirit comes, you slap the pan 3 times, and then everyone greets you, Akwaba, right? And then you get to the business that matter. But it is so pure. That's a ratchet witness. There's no drumming. But now, in some cases, for Okomfo, which is distinct from Busumfo, right? Okomfo, they're like self-employed, self-employed or contractors. They work for anyone. The Busumfo works for their family. So this doesn't belong to Kofi Donko, it belongs to the family. And if they wanted to unseat him, to choose someone else, they could do that. It belongs to the family, right? It's rooted in the master clan. Whereas the Komfo can go anywhere and say, hey, you need services? Yeah, I'll do this for you. You need services? I got you, right? The Busumfo, they're operating within the family, right? And so it's these distinctions where some need drumming to induce this state, whereas I'm telling you, it's the pure, it's just words. It's just words. And it's one of the, I think, the most purest thing that I've sort of experienced in terms of spirituality, right? There's nothing, there's no text, there's no book, there's no priest, it's just you and words. And it's like a meditation, right? So I'll pause there because I don't want to monopolize the question and answer, but I hope that gives you some, now I go much more into the distinction between these categories of healers, into the meaning of a koum and how that translates in social practice. So I do go into that much more.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Thank you, Professor, for such a fascinating presentation. I was able to learn a lot from today. My question to you is, do healers specialize in certain area of the body? Because in certain cultures in the world, I've seen that they target certain areas of the body, or based on, they just do children or older folks. And then another question adding to that is, as you see modern medicine growing and people are having more access to that, sometimes people now what they do is they first go to modern medicine and then they're not able to solve their problem, then they come and ask help for healers. Do you see that in Ghana, where you're from as well?
Well, I'm not from Ghana, but yes, that's where no, that's okay. It's quite all right. So to your first question, there certainly are. Well, I'll start with the second one first. You definitely see that there are people who will approach the healers still, but what I would suggest is that counterintuitively, why they approach the healers is not as we might expect. Meaning, I looked at a number of places, Kenya, Ghana, a few other places, and in that, what I saw is that in some communities, people will approach indigenous healers because of the way that they're embedded in the community. Meaning, Unlike the hospitals and clinics that you have to pay in cash, healers you pay in kind. And so the structuration of payment often precludes people not going to the hospitals, right, on one level. Because you can work out, in other words, payment is not the most important thing, particularly where I was trained and what I've seen in Techiman and around they're much more flexible because these people are part of the community, whereas the hospitals are often foreign institutions that sort of, implant themselves in these communities. And they do so with their own fee structures and own ideological, superiority and leanings. And so that's one caveat I offer is that, because of the way in which, people can make payment, and because there's also a feedback loop where in the Techiman case, patients come back to the healer and say, did the process work or did not work? So healers don't get compensated in kind or otherwise until the treatment is effective. And if healers cannot, then they will refer to other healers who can. Which brings me to the first question, which is that is yes and no. Yes, there are healers who specialize in certain kinds of ailments. Kofi Donko was wildly popular among children, wildly popular, especially mothers who were Yoruba mothers from Nigeria that were in Techiman, and there were thousands of Yoruba mothers there. They loved him. So he dealt with anyone. So in the one hand, healers are general practitioners, right? They deal with psychosomatic, cognitive or emotional, physical, but also spiritual ailments. So their holistic view makes them general practitioners, but then you do have healers on the other hand who will specialize, for example, with children, right? With Kofi Donko's wife, Afia Munafia, will specialize, for example, with women, right? Whereas Kofi Donko was more the general practitioner. He dealt with everyone, but he had a particular, according to the records, a large part of the clientele were children, right? From infants to 2 or 3 years old, a large part. But then he had also 33%, from my calculations, of adults, right? And then adolescents and people, young folks in between. So he had a wide range, I think, in terms of his therapeutic offerings, whereas others may have particular pension. Lastly, I'll say is that there's also different categories of healer, which goes back to your question, where the Odunsini are the pure herbalists. They don't go into trance or spiritual communion. They don't carry the pan. They just deal with herb medicine. In fact, the word Odunsini means one who sort of deals with the barks of trees, right? And so they deal purely with herb medicines. They don't offer any, sort of talismanic, offerings. They deal purely with medicines. Then you have those who are bone setters, right? Who deal with, as you saw in the previous, I can get this here. There's a previous areas, right? Kofi Donko did it all, but there were those that specialized in just bone setting, wrist, elbow, joints, foot, as a little child, and probably broke his ankle, right? So there are those that specialize only in bone. Then you have midwives, right? Who specialize in the care of new mothers. So you have both practitioners, specialists, and you have those that different categories of healers that people can go to for particular kinds of maladies that they may encounter.
My question is about the tapes and the anthropologists.
Mm-hmm.
What is your assumption about the tapes? And what do you think that they showed in terms of if he's the central figure of these books and he's destroying the maps or whatever he's doing to them? Because you kind of spoke about it and then transitioned.
I did because I figured somebody would ask about it. Well, I don't have any assumptions. My job as a historian is to just interpret the evidence. And my interpretation is that it just doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. That there are other tapes. In fact, I looked for I found audio tapes at Indiana. They're there, of other people. And I said, wait a second, if your principal informant is, you erased those tapes and kept others who were peripheral, that to me does not make sense. It does not add up. Something going on. And to add to this, this mystery, right? This case.